So welcome to today's Edible Gardening Series class. My name is Sarah Bostic, and I am the Sustainable Agriculture Extension Agent with the University of Florida in Sarasota County. And I am joined today by two of my absolutely fantastic coworkers, Carol Wyatt Evans, who is the Chemicals and the Environment Agent, and Mindy Hannick, who is the School and Community Gardens Coordinator for Sarasota County. So we have, this is actually going to be the 16th class in our series. We started back in October, and can't remember if we've told y'all or not, but we are actually going to do a grand total of 25 classes in this series. So we have just recently posted the April and May classes for the series, so check those out. And we started this series a few months ago because we were hearing from so many people that they were trying to have a successful garden and just really struggling to do that. And a lot of those folks had moved to Florida from somewhere else. But many of them had lived right here in Florida all their lives and were still struggling to garden. And so we decided to give this series a try. And we've been having a huge amount of fun with it. So today's class is growing in pots and other containers, tips and ideas for success. And so today's class will be a fairly Florida focused class, just like most of ours are, but I'll make sure we weave in plenty of tips and ideas for folks that are joining us from other parts of the country as well. So here we go. Oh, and before we jump in, really quickly, for anyone who is new to our series, I'm going to spend about 15 minutes talking about the topic, and then we actually usually stick around until about 1 o'clock to answer all of your questions. So if you have questions, please type them into that chat box. Because we're expecting a very large group today, there was close to 250 people who registered for today's class. We're going to ask that you keep your microphone on mute and type your questions right there in the chat box, and Mindy will moderate the chat box. So here we go. So one of the things that I love the most about container gardens is that they are really anything you want them to be. You can be as creative as you want to with a container garden. And some containers make better containers for edibles than others. So for example, I love this picture of whimsical containers like old basketballs and tennis shoes to grow plants. I personally would not grow things like basil and lettuce in one of my old pair of tennis shoes. And I'm guessing most of you would also choose not to. But container gardening is a really neat thing for so many reasons. Even if you do have outdoor space where you can plant directly into the ground, there are some reasons that sometimes container gardening can actually be a better option than planting directly into the ground. So I'm going to go through a few of those reasons that I'm a big fan of container gardening. One is that containers are movable. We don't always pick the right spot the first time around when we are trying to figure out how to grow different things. Sometimes we discover we've put something in a spot that's too windy or too shady or even too sunny. So with containers, you can move things around. So there's, things like mint can sometimes absolutely take over a garden. And so there's a handful of plants like mint where if you don't want to have an entire garden full of just that plant, putting it in a pot can be a great idea, especially if that pot is propped up off the ground so that it can't sink its root system down into your regular garden soil. Another one of the really big benefits to container gardening or gardening in pots is disease management. So many of the diseases that we struggle with plants actually live in the soil. They spend, in cold places, they spend the winter overwintering in the soil, and in hot places like Florida, they spend the summer hanging out in the soil waiting for the next crop. So with containers, you can start over with fresh, undiseased soil as many times as you want, and that's something you can't do when you're gardening directly in the ground. And you can just reuse pots by washing them out with hot soapy water and starting with new potting mix. That's a huge benefit when it comes to disease management. Across the southeastern United States, we have a little creature. It's a little microorganism that lives in soil. It's called a nematode. We actually did a whole class on nematodes earlier in this series. If you are curious to learn more about them or have ever seen root systems on your plants that look anything like these pictures, you might have nematodes. And nematodes can do some major damage to plants. And so another big benefit to containers, growing into containers, is that as long as you have those containers propped up off the ground, the nematodes can't actually get into your potting soil. So that's a great way to keep your garden nematode free. And then this is just a really important note to make about urban soil. If you are an urban gardener, it's really good to know that across our country, a lot of urban soil has quite elevated levels of heavy metals, and lead tends to be the primary heavy metal that's in higher concentrations in urban areas, but there's others too that you may find in your urban soils, things like cadmium and mercury. And there's a handful of reasons why urban areas tend to have elevated lead levels. A lot of that is about all of the lead paint that was used for many years in the United States, as well as lead being used as an additive in gasoline. And then things like really old lead-lined pipes and fixtures and faucets that are starting to actually degrade. And so there are base levels that our federal government considers to be safe for food consumption. But once it actually makes it into your body through eating food grown in soil that had lead in it, there's actually no known level that's really safe. So if you're growing in urban soil, you can actually send a soil sample off to actually figure out whether or not you have lead in your soil. Or you can just kind of go with the assumption that you probably have contaminated soil and grow in pots. So another thing that I love so much about container gardening is that you get to be so creative with it, right? It's kind of the sky is the limit when it comes to what you are growing in within certain parameters, right? You can also take advantage of things like vertical space, like hanging pots off of the side of a wall or a fence, reusing old tubs, things like that. There's just so many creative ways to go about it, and you don't have to be fancy, right? Like I've grown amazing tomatoes in a 5-gallon bucket before. So there's all sorts of containers that you can use for growing gardens. Things like planter boxes. All of those can be used and adapted for growing edibles. So you can use pretty much anything to grow edibles in terms of different kind of containers. But here's the little trick about container gardening, is that growing in a container is really not a natural place for a plant. And so your plants are more likely to be stressed than they would be if they were planted directly in the ground. It doesn't mean that they will be more stressed. It just means they're more likely to be. So learning what some of the signs of plant stress looks like is a really great idea when you're getting into container gardening, so that you can quickly start to figure out that something that I'm doing is causing stress for my plant. And one really common sign of stress in a potted plant is premature flowering, or flowering when a plant is still really, really small and really immature. I actually just took these pictures last week of some tomato seedlings that we had that have been sitting for much too long in a tray. They looked great when we received them, but they've just been sitting there without a home for a couple of weeks, and they've gotten really stressed. So you can see this is a tomato that is about the size of a ballpoint pen, and it already has multiple flowers on it. That is not a good sign. That is a sign of a plant that recognizes that based on its environment, it's not going to be able to survive a whole lot longer. And so it's going to try to reproduce before it dies. It's going to try to finish out its life cycle by reproducing, getting new seeds out into the world, and then giving up. So that's really what flowering on immature plants is about, is they recognize that they're near the end of their life. They're trying to give it one last go to reproduce. So one great way to diminish the stress that your plants have in pots and other containers is to make sure that you are providing enough space for the root system of your plant. And a really good rule of thumb is that the amount of root that is growing in the soil is approximately the same as the amount of plant growth that you see above the soil, right? And so putting a plant in a pot that is really, really small is really, really stressful because it's a plant that is trying to have a much bigger root system than you're actually giving it space to have. Another really important thing when it comes to container gardening is making sure that there is adequate drainage. It's really easy to either under or overwater a plant when you have an edible garden in containers. And the quickest way to overwater a plant is to not have sufficient drainage. So pull out your drill or a chisel or something like that and make some good holes in the bottom of a container if you're using a container that was not actually manufactured for the purpose of drainage. And then if you are growing right up against the ground, if you have something like, if you're growing on like clay soil, or if your pot is sitting on something like clay soil, you might actually want to also prop that plant pot up off the ground, because even with holes in the bottom, it may have trouble draining out. In our sandy soil, not so much of a problem. Sorry about that. That was my phone that I apparently forgot to put on silent ringing. So this really fine balance between enough water but not too much water, right? So down here in Florida, most of our edible gardening season is during our dry season, where it rains very, very little during the winter. And that means that you have to provide all of the water that your edible garden is going to need, your garden in a pot. And depending on what kind of plant that is that you have growing in a pot, that could be a lot of watering. It could be daily watering. Some plants won't need as much. Sometimes if it's been very, very windy, you'll need to water more often, or if it's been hotter than normal, you'll need to water more often. So there's a handful of ways to deal with needing to water a lot more than is convenient for our busy schedules. And one is that you may want to consider putting in a really simple automatic irrigation system that has little lines that actually run right in your potted plants. And then another is actually using mulch right in your potted plants. This is a picture of a pomegranate tree in a pot. And you can see this pomegranate tree is actually not in a pot that's really, really big enough for it. So it does have an automatic irrigation system attached to it, but it's also mulched with Spanish moss that dropped out of trees. And that layer of mulch just helps to keep the soil moister for longer. There's all sorts of things that you can use to directly mulch right into your potted plants. I love things like Spanish moss or pine straw, wood chips, other things that you might have wherever it is that you're living. And remember, if you do use Spanish moss, don't pull it out of trees. Just pick it up off the ground. We have a native bat that makes its home in the Spanish moss that is still attached to trees. So leave those bats' homes alone on your trees. This is actually a picture from my own back balcony. This is a little self-watering container that I have on my back balcony. It is about it's about two feet wide and about a foot and a half in length, and about a foot deep. You can't quite tell, but this is where I recently harvested a whole bunch of cilantro from this area, and I've got a handful of other plants in it. This is actually a couple of big clumps of beautiful parsley. This little black tube right here is what makes this system so neat. And you can buy it as like a ready-to-go kit, or you can make it yourself. So the basics of how a self-watering container works is that you have usually a pretty big container, something like I have on my porch. And then there's basically a shelf inside, like at the bottom of that container. And the water, you add water by pouring it into a tube like this. And so the water goes right to the bottom where plants actually prefer to pull their water from, goes right to the bottom of that container. But the plants are held up out of the water, so they're not just sitting soggy in water. It's a really neat system. We'll send you some instructions on how to do a do-it-yourself self-watering container. I'm going to make a quick note about terracotta pots. I love the aesthetic of terracotta pots. I think they are just beautiful, and they do not hold on to water very well at all. They dry out very, very fast. So I'm showing you these two pictures in particular because these are great examples of what plants that are very water deficient look like. This is a pepper seedling growing in a terracotta pot that has had a very stressful life up till this point. That is a very water stressed and nutrient stressed pepper seedling. And then here we have basil across the top, and you can just look at that basil and know it is not going to taste very good, right? It's bitter, it's tough, it's kind of sharp, it's not great basil, and it's because it's severely water stressed. And then down here, you probably can't even tell what this is because it's almost unrecognizable. It's cilantro that became so water stressed that it started to send up these lovely little white flowers. So it has decided it's done with its life. So if you, like me, love the aesthetic of terracotta pots, but don't want to spend the rest of your life keeping up with watering your terracotta pots, you can always use a plastic liner or plastic plant pot inside of your terracotta pot, and that really helps with retaining water. And then one of the things that can be really tricky about container gardening is making sure that your plants are getting sufficient light. Many folks that are growing in containers are growing in containers because they're really space limited, right? They're very limited in the amount of outdoor space they have. So it's really important to remember that plants need a lot of light. They have to have light in order to survive. They can't get everything they need from fertilizer. They get most of what they need actually from this truly amazing chemical process that happens through sunlight. And so even things like greens and herbs still need a good bit of light. And so if you're having plants that are really struggling and you know that your plants are getting less than about half a day's worth of sun each day, that's probably why. Great thing about containers is that you can pick them up and move them. So if you're growing herbs and greens, those plants really do best with 6 to 8 hours a day of direct sunlight. And then anything that produces a fruit, like a tomato or a cucumber, it really needs full day sun, but it can survive on as little as 6 hours. It's not going to thrive, but it will survive on less than that. So one of the last considerations is potting soil, right? This is actually really, really important. So potting soil it's really important to think about 3 different things. Plants need to have air in their root system. There needs to be air around. They also need to have enough water, but not too much water. So the best way to achieve that for your plants is either by buying a bagged potting mix, like from a garden center, something like that, or make your own potting mix, usually through something like compost and then some form of what I call fluff that you mix in with the compost. And that fluff can come in different ways. One of the really common components that you'll see in bagged potting mix that you can actually purchase and add into your own mix is perlite. Those little white dots that in a lot of potting mix that you can see here on your screen that look kind of like pieces of styrofoam. That's actually a rock. It's a mined mineral. So one thing to know about perlite is that it's mined. It's a mined mineral, and it's also very effective at adding some of that air space into your potting soil. Peat moss is also very commonly used in potting soil. It's worth noting that peat moss is only kind of a renewable resource, right? Like within our own lifetimes, it's not really renewable. It's harvested from very old peat bogs in cold cold regions of the country, or of the world rather. So a third option for fluff is coconut coir, which is a byproduct of the coconut industry. So, all that coconut water that is such a craze right now, the actual hull of the coconut is basically shredded and then sold. So that is another good option for the fluff part of potting soil. One thing that it is very important to not use is soil that you dig up from the backyard for a handful of reasons, including that it could be contaminated soil if you're in an urban area. If you live in the Southeast, it is definitely contaminated with nematodes, which will definitely damage your plants. And then soil is very different in ground than when dug up and put in a pot, right? Soil from in ground just doesn't work super well in a container. And so it's really better to go with something that is that's blended to actually do well in the unnatural environment of a pot or some other container. And then it's also really good to know that plants that are grown in pots are not as stable as plants that are grown in the ground. And so you may end up having to use some sort of trellis or support for plants, even if you're not used to using some sort of trellis or support when you grow them in the ground. They just aren't as stable, right? They're contained in a little pot. And so when the wind blows, they just have less ability to be stable in their pot than they would if they had wide spreading roots out into the ground, right? So you may need to think about some sort of support system. And last but not least, there are indeed a handful of things that you should not plant edible plants into. One of which is tires. I know when I was in elementary school in the 1980s, there were school gardens made entirely of old tires, things like that. We didn't really realize the impact of a lot of the heavy metals that were leaching out of tires and into soil. So tires are definitely something you should not be planting food directly into. Same goes for any kind of container that used to be used for chemicals or petroleum products. There will be some residue that is simply not good for your health. And same goes for any sort of container that has peeling or chipped paint, right? Paint as it breaks down is something we just don't want to consume. So that's what I've got for you today. And so with that, I just wanted to say thank you so very much for joining us, for those of you who have been in every single class for the whole series thus far, and for those of you who are just joining. We absolutely love starting our week every week with this series. So thank you for being a part of how we get to start our week every week. And we will hopefully see many of you next week.